Okay, I think we're ready to start. So thank you everyone who has come today. We're on our second to last forum, so we're kind of winding down to the end. We have one more after this, which if you're lucky, someone else will be able to come in and teach. Before we jump into it, does anyone have any questions for me about anything we've covered before or about this or anything in general? Okay, great. We'll start. I'll share my screen. And here we are. So today we're talking about small piece to big piece. Now, this is actually going to be a little bit different than the other modules that we've talked about and covered in these forums. And this is kind of in two ways. First off, we're going to be changing the question, maybe not the question in itself, but we're going to be changing the context that we've been asking our main question. So far we've been asking, how do we transform destructive conflict to constructive conflict? And we've been talking about how dangerous love makes that possible. Now we've been asking that primarily about interpersonal relationships. So we might have a family member, we might have a friend, a coworker, roommate, whatever the relationship is that we have conflict with, and we're asking, how do we transform that conflict and practice dangerous love in that relationship? So today we're going to be asking that same question, but we're going to be asking it about much larger conflicts. So large scale conflicts between bigger groups of people. How do we transform these bigger conflicts from destructive patterns to constructive patterns? How do we have dangerous love there? And so that's the first way this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to kind of shift the question. And part of that, we're not really going to talk about the steps, the 4-step processes deeply, though those all are going to be part of this. And then the second way we're going to talk about this is a little bit how we're going to approach. Oh, wait, someone's here. Let's let them. Is a little bit how we're going to approach this. So far, again, we've been talking about this primarily from the perspective of personal improvement, because we've been trying to learn how we can have dangerous love in our relationships. That's still going to be true to some extent today, but we're going to be thinking even about this a little bit more as peace practitioners. How do we, maybe we're part of one of these conflicts and in one of these groups, and if so, then there's definitely going to be personal, there's going to be introspection in that way, but we're also going to be asking this question of how do we help other groups as a third party engage in these constructive patterns of conflict. And so that's a little bit of an introduction from small piece to big piece. Does anyone have any questions about that? No, okay. We'll move on. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this principle that's going to underline pretty much everything we're going to talk about today. It's called Ubuntu. Is anyone familiar with this? Anyone heard this before? We've talked about it sometimes in peace building. No? No one's ever heard of it? That's okay. It's not the most probably thing we center on. So to give you a little background of where this principle comes from, it comes out of South Africa in the 1990s during the transitionary period between the apartheid government and democracy. And so if not everyone may know 100% a ton about that conflict, but apartheid was a period of time where racial segregation was the political institution. Where whites and blacks and other ethnic groups were different classes of individuals, and the white group of people who lived in South Africa were kind of the dominant class, and they ran the government. And because of that political system, it ended up in a myriad amount of human rights abuses. And there was a lot of politically motivated violence, a lot of racially motivated violence. And in the 1990s, what happened was they started to dismantle the apartheid regime and start to institute democracy. But they were left with this question of how do we handle this past, for the last 40, 50 years that's existed in South Africa? How do we deal with all these human rights abuses? How do we handle them without this just spawning more conflict? How do we stop it from turning destructive is the question the leaders in South Africa were asking. And Ubuntu was a principle that kind of came out of that was how they were going to be able to accomplish it. And so here's a little quote from Desmond Tutu, one of the religious leaders that inspired this. Would anyone like to read that for us?
I can read it.
Thank you.
Ubuntu is very difficult to render into a Western language. It speaks of the very essence of being human. You are generous, you are hospitable, you are friendly and caring and compassionate. You share what you have. It is to say, my humanity is caught up, is in inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. We say a person is a person through other persons.
Okay, so a person is a person through other persons. And so what we see in Ubuntu is that at its core, it's the idea that each human being is a link in a larger chain of humanity. And what happens in conflict and what had been happening in South Africa is that as we deny the humanity of others, those links start to become broken and we start to break apart the links, the whole thing. And so Ubuntu's central concern is the healing of breaches, the redressing of imbalances, and the restoration of broken relationships, as seeking to rehabilitate both the victim and the perpetrator. And so as we do that, we start to reconnect the links that bind us together as a whole. And so it promotes unity over division. And this was the philosophy that undergirded all of their reconciliation efforts that then happened in South Africa. And we'll actually talk a little bit about that. And so when we're thinking about large scale conflict, what we're thinking about is these large groups of people that have disconnected from each other, that have broken the links that bind us all together as humanity. And so the question for us when we're trying to approach large scale conflict, whether we're a member of one of those groups or not, is how do we reconnect those links? And how do we bind it all back together again into this one human chain? And so there's going to be a process that we're going to talk about right here about how we do it. It's going to be our journey from small piece to big piece. And so the first step, of course, is going to be personal improvement. Why do you think personal improvement, even in this, when we're talking about big piece, is still the first step and an important step?
I think part of it is that in order for other people to turn, we need to have turned. And I think it works on a bigger scale because in order for us to know how to help people change, we either need to be changing or have had that experience to teach them to change.
Great. Any other thoughts about that? Why is personal improvement still an important step? No? Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that then. But to highlight that, Rachel, that I think is really kind of the core of it. We're asking people to engage in this constructive process is a lot to ask. And if we've never done it ourselves, it's going to be hard for us to teach them and guide them through that process. And so personal improvement, though, is what we've been talking about throughout this entire series of forums. We've been talking about how we can overcome our fear, how we can overcome our fear of people and conflict itself, how we can turn first and then ultimately invite others to turn. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but it's important to recognize that as an important step. So as we start to move from personal improvement and we try to start moving to bigger piece, the first thing we do is we go to what we're going to call our sphere of influence. And so our sphere of influence is anyone in our life that we have that we feel like influences us or we influence. And this doesn't have to even necessarily be positive. It can be someone who we feel like, has a negative influence or maybe that we have a negative influence over, at least in terms that we're in conflict right now. And what we're asking here is who's in our sphere of influence and how do we help other people in our sphere of influence love dangerously? And so this isn't just loving dangerously, okay, I have a coworker who I'm in a big conflict with. I'm going to help us in our relationship love dangerously, but it's asking in all our relationships, what can we do to invite others to love dangerously? And how can we ultimately love them dangerously as well? And so we're going to do a little activity. And so what I want to do, if you have, you're on a computer or something, just type it out. If you have pen and paper in front of you, You can write it out too. And we're going to ask who is in our sphere of influence. And this can be really anyone who we feel like we have a relationship with on some level. And so everyone just, take a few, no, we won't take a few minutes, but we'll take a minute and we'll write that out. Who is in your sphere of influence? Your sphere of influence. Okay, and then we're going to ask a second question. You can keep working on that first one too, is what can you do to invite those in your sphere to love dangerously? Would anyone want to share maybe something they wrote down? It doesn't have to be specific to a person, but just maybe something generic you wrote down about ways you feel like you can invite those in your sphere to love dangerously.
I can just share something. Um, so if you guys get annoyed of me talking, then feel free to talk. But yeah, I was thinking just to invite them to love dangerously is to love them dangerously and to choose to see them as human beings and to genuinely like love them and have genuine interactions with them.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked a lot about that, the power of invitations. When we see people as people, when we love them dangerously, that creates a powerful invitation for them to see us in the same way. And hopefully that even in some ways can invite them to see others in their lives in that same way as well. Cool. Any other thoughts of ways that what we can do to invite those in our sphere to love dangerously? Okay, we'll move on then. So when we're thinking about this journey that we're going on from small piece to big piece, where we are now to where we want to go. So we've talked about sphere of influence. And one way we could think about sphere of influence is not only helping them love dangerously in their relationships, but also they're kind of joining with us on this path to establish a large scale piece. And so the next three steps are all really intertwined. They come from the same kind of theory. But each of them is going to be critical to this process. And so it's establishing cultural peace, establishing structural peace, and then ultimately establishing direct peace. And so here's how this works. So all these theories come from the same guy. His name's Galtung, Johann Galtung. And in the 1960s, he was trying to find really a theory to help describe why destructive conflict happens. And he terms this as direct violence. If you've been in some of the classes here in peace building, we've talked about this. He frames destructive conflict as direct violence because in large scale conflicts, violence is frequently present. But we can think about direct violence not only as literally violent acts, but also anything that we do to help continue the cycle, the conflict tornado we talked about if you were there, anything we do to continue that cycle of violence and escalate it further. And so Galtung helps us understand why do we do that? Why does that happen, especially on large scales? And he came up first off with one answer, and ultimately he has two real explanations for this. So first off, he said, okay, we have direct violence, and part of the reason we have direct violence is because of something called structural violence. Now, structural violence is legal institutions, or you can even think in a company, maybe a policy they have. There's a couple of different ways this works, but structures that are put in place that make direct violence seem okay, or even not punishable. And so one of the examples we already brought up was South Africa. Apartheid was a political organization that was based on segregation. And so when you have a structure, a legal structure like that, or in the United States, when it implemented those things, those are examples of structural violence that goes on, that makes direct violence more likely. It gives it legitimacy, and it makes it as well so that when people engage in that direct violence against certain groups of people, it isn't punished, and they can get away with it. And so this was Galtung's first answer of why direct violence often happens in societies. Now, a couple of years later, about 30 years later, in 1990s, he said, he continued to do research on this. He's a peace researcher. And he said, there's actually another thing that's actually even deeper than structural violence. That is the reason direct violence and destructive conflict happens, and that's cultural violence. And this isn't necessarily saying, aspects of cultures are violent inherently, though that could be true. But this is saying that there are ways that we see the world in our worldview and in a set of beliefs that guide how we act that can dehumanize other groups of people and other people specifically. And so things like racism and sexism are examples of cultural beliefs we may hold that dehumanize and degrade the humanity of another human being. We've actually even talked about another example of cultural violence extensively throughout the Dangerous Love workshop, which is seeing people as objects or having an I-it perspective. That's another example of cultural violence because we're taking away people's humanity and instead seeing them as objects. And so then Galtung came with this, okay, so this is our triangle of violence. Most of the time when we're trying to establish peace, we think mostly of the direct violence that's happening because it's visible, it's above the surface. We can see it, it's clear, and so we try to mitigate those. But those instances, those events of direct violence are actually symptoms of a deeper problem, which is invisible, below the surface, this structural violence and this cultural violence. And so if we really want to put it in terms of a triangle of peace, which Galtung also did, we want to have direct peace. We want to create a peaceful society. Then we first off need to address the underlying symptom of structural peace and create structures that protect peace and invite peace. And then also look into the cultures that we're dealing with and look into the perspectives and the worldviews that people have and find where are the instances of dehumanization. How do we change those? How do we take those out? And then how do we replace them with humanizing the other person? And that if we work on the invisible side here, we start at the bottom, we deal with the root of it, then we're able to get the symptom of the visible. And so if we go back to our journey of small peace to big peace, we have our people there. They're going to establish cultural peace. It changes how they see people. They invite cultural things that help them see people as people. Then they establish structures that protect that and also facilitate peace. And then the result of that is we reach direct peace. So in this last process, this idea of establishing cultural peace, structural peace, direct peace, how do you think that relates to our earlier principle we talked about of Ubuntu and this reconnecting of this human chain? Do you need me to repeat the question? Or are we just not sure?
Yeah, will you repeat the question?
Yes. So how does kind of these principles from Galtung of establishing cultural peace, direct peace, structure peace, how do you think that relates to that earlier principle we talked about of Ubuntu?
I think that, at least from like studying about the apartheid and all that happened in South Africa, I just know that like the structural violence specifically was like perpetuating the violence to continue, or it was like allowing the what was, I forget like the specific names, but yeah, it was making it so that one group of people could put themselves above the other and feel justified in doing that. And I know you kind of already explained that, but just it perpetuates the violence. So unless those things are addressed and start to be worked out, it's just going to be continued. If that's answering your question.
Definitely. Yeah, and definitely how, we can't address those, we can't address the direct violence or establish direct peace without fixing the underlying problems, definitely. Any other thoughts about that? How does this idea of reconnecting humanity in this larger chain, how does that relate to these principles? Okay, well, I think for me at least, what I'll just say about that is I always think about how, when we're thinking about interpersonal peace, which we've talked a lot about, moving to this large scale peace, I think a lot of times I think it's a different process that goes on. But I think one thing we learn from all of this is that at its root, the problem is still the same that people have, that we need to be able to help people see and respect the humanity of others and reconnect them in that way, even on a large scale of conflict. And we need to help them be able to see people's people in those very same ways. And so some ways, interpersonal peace and direct peace are very closely related because both of them need this principle of Ubuntu to really work. And so now we're going to do a little activity. So if you guys are scanning, want to get a piece of paper, just type it on your computer. We're going to ask you these 3 questions. So you can think about these, maybe you're in peace building right now and you're thinking about a large scale conflict and it's something that's interests you and you want to work with. And so these questions will be more relevant to you if you think about it in that context. But even if that's not the case, you can think about these just about in your life or maybe in your family in kind of a small scale too. And I think they still apply to you. How do you, what is your vision for cultural peace? What is your vision for structural peace? And what is your vision for peace directly? And so I'll give you guys a minute and you can write down, or we won't share these necessarily, but I'll just give you a minute to write down some thoughts on that. And if anyone has any questions as well, feel free to ask. Okay, does anyone want any more time on that one? No? Okay. We'll move on to the second one, which is it's very similar. I'll just give you a minute for this too. What can you do to establish a culture of peace? What can you do to establish structures of peace? And ultimately, what can we do to establish direct peace? Okay, does anyone want any more time with that one? No? Okay, we'll keep moving. Okay, so now we're going to get to the next part of this. This is kind of the second half, if you will. So like when we talked about dangerous love, if you were there for our reconciliation day, part of what we talked about is even when we were able to establish cultural structures and direct peace, we're still left with a past that's littered with instances of wrongs that have been committed. And in the case of South Africa, which is what we're going to talk about specifically here, we see a past littered with a myriad of human rights abuses. And even though we've established all those structures and we've fixed some of those cultural aspects, at least in terms of helping people us be able to see other groups as people, you know, there still needs to be dealt with what's happened in the past. And so that's where reconciliation comes in. And what we're going to do is a little bit different to how we talked about last time is we're actually going to watch a little video here of a scene from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So a few things about this scene. First off, so this is from a movie. It's from a film. And what you're going to see is portrayed by actors. You'll see Samuel L. Jackson's in there, a classic. But it's what actually happens in this is from the TRC. So what happened when they made this movie is they took a transcript of events that happened, and now they're just reacting out literal events. Also, just as a trigger warning about this video, just the nature of the human rights abuse that happened in South Africa. It's very violent, and so there's nothing violent in this video. But the way the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was set up is they brought both the perpetrator of crimes with the victim, and the perpetrator was asked to confess, essentially, what the wrongs that they had done to kind of uphold the apartheid regime. And the new government said, you know, if you will do that, if you'll come to the TRC and confess what you've done, you'll be given amnesty. But you have to do it with the victim there. And so this event that we're going to see is the event of a man who killed a young boy's parents. And he's going to explain a little bit about of how that happened. And so it's a little bit graphic just in that description. It's not terrible. Otherwise, we wouldn't show it here. But just so you know that that's what it's going to be. And so we're going to watch this video, and then we're going to watch a second video right after it. That's from Desmond Tutu, one of those leaders who led this and instituted it. And he's going to be talking about what he learned from it. And what we want to look for throughout this video is how do we see that principle of Ubuntu play out, and how do we see reconciliation play out? And then we're going to talk about each of those. So I'm just going to quickly go to that. I need to stop sharing my screen because there's actually a better way to share video clips. Okay, that should be good now. And so as anyway, I didn't even finish that. So also in terms of that trigger warning, so if you need to leave or anything, you feel uncomfortable listening to that, feel free to do so at this time. But here's this kind of first clip.
This child, Peter Makeba, has not spoken one word since the day he saw his parents murdered in front of his eyes.
I started to strangle Mr. Makeba. He struggled violently. Sergeant Skempers smothered him with a pillow over his face. Then I fired 4 shots with my AK through the pillow. There was blood and feathers everywhere. The woman was hiding under the bed. Sergeant Skempers killed her. We didn't know the boy was there. He just stood there, looking at me. I could see his mother's body lying there. I pointed my gun right at him. I was going to shoot. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. I couldn't do it. I defied an order. I can't sleep. When I close my eyes, all I see is him. I'll look after him. I'll pay his school fees. Please, let me do something. Please.
Okay, so that's just the first brief clip of that. Now we're going to watch this other clip. So this is Desmond Tutu. This is an interview. He's talking about what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission taught him. And again, we're just looking at how do we see this process of reconciliation? We'll talk a little bit more about what that is in a second. How do we see Ubuntu play out through this example?
I have come to realize the extraordinary capacity for evil that all of us have. Because, you know, we've now had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there have been revelations of horrendous atrocities that people have committed. Any and every one of us could have perpetrated those atrocities. The people who were perpetrators of the most gruesome things didn't have horns, didn't have tails. They were ordinary human beings like you and me. That's the one thing. Devastating. But the other, more exhilarating than anything that I have ever experienced, and something I hadn't expected, to discover that we have an extraordinary capacity for good. People who suffered untold misery. People who should have been riddled with bitterness, resentment, and anger come to the commission and exhibit an extraordinary magnanimity, a nobility of spirit in their willingness to forgive. And you say, human beings actually are fundamentally good. Human beings are fundamentally good. The aberration, in fact, is the evil one. For God created us ultimately for God, for goodness, for laughter, for joy, for compassion, for caring.
Okay. First off, could you guys hear those? Okay, good. Should have asked after the first video. That would have made more sense, but it sounds like it worked out. And so the first question I want to ask is, how did you guys see Ubuntu play out? And, you know, we saw a scene from the actual TRC. We saw Desmond Tutu talk about it. What are some things that stood out to you from that?
I think that it restored the belief that we all, like Tutu was saying, that we all have such an ability for evil and such an ability for good. And it restored the links and those connections because of that.
Definitely, there's this recognition from someone who's not actually done any of the things that are wrong, who's actually trying to help this process, and he's saying, you know, I could have done those things. Any one of us could have done those things, had we been in their shoes, had we been in their position. And so, you know, we're starting to see this process of reconciliation play out. So we have it up on the screen: truth, mercy, justice, peace. And so obviously we see truth play out there. People are sharing what's actually happened and what's gone on, and they're bringing the truth out into the open. And we also saw mercy in those scenes as they're offering forgiveness from them if they'll come and participate in this process. And then that ultimately leads, you know, part of the truth and reconciliation. One of the things I think we saw from, at least in that clip, was that there's this, that going through truth and mercy, going through that process of reconciliation creates this desire to restore what you've taken away. And we saw the one man who was confessing what he had done. You know, he's desperate in many ways to have anything he can do to restore, at least in some measure, what he's done to take away from that boy. And so we see justice start to play out in its restorative capacity. And then ultimately, we hope that leads to peace, where now in the future, whenever these conflicts arise, they can be handled in this reconciliation way. What other ways did you guys see, you know, any of these strands play out, either truth or mercy or justice or peace? What are some other ways you saw that in that clip?
I think for me, like the little boy showing mercy, like he probably didn't understand everything that was happening in that moment or in that situation, but he was able to show mercy regardless of the fact that he didn't understand everything and he didn't know what was happening, and he just let go of the things and was able to, I mean, give the man a hug. And so, yeah, for me, like that is like a beautiful show of mercy, is that not understanding everything and not knowing everything, but still being willing to make the first move, or to make a move and say sorry, or say it's okay.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was a great act of mercy that we saw. And I think it's somewhat, to me, impactful to, you know, that it's a child who has the strength to do that and the capacity to do that. And I think that just, for me, is something that I think is introspective. Any other thoughts on that? Any other ways that you saw these play out? No? Okay, then. Well, that's the end of this workshop. You know, remember, we're looking at this from the lens of how do we transform large scale destructive conflict to constructive conflict. And we've gone through, okay, you know, we need to go through personal improvement, working through our sphere of influence, establishing cultural peace in these conflicts with the two sides that are warring against each other, then establishing structural peace, direct peace, and then ultimately, you know, dealing as well with the consequences of the fact that destructive conflict even happened in the first place through this process of reconciliation. And so, does anyone have any questions for me before we end today?
I just have one question.
Yeah.
So the structural, this is like going back to, I think, was it Gottman or something? No, whoever it was. But like his, his belief on just the idea of structural violence. Can that be like, can that also be considered like in families having structural violence, and like having things set up or like rules set up that like perpetuate violence in the home?
Yeah, I certainly think that's possible. If you think about, you know, power as kind of a more amorphous thing that's not just confined to politics, you know, you can think in a family structure, you know, there are certain people that have power and certain people that don't. And, you know, you can set up rules and enforce those rules, and that can create structures that can inherently create violence. And maybe violence is a strong word for that, but at least can kind of provoke destructive conflict, we can say.
Okay, perfect. That's what I want to know.
Great. Any other thoughts? or questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you guys for coming today. This one was a little bit shorter, not that much shorter, but a little bit shorter. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to message me or something like that. And I'll see you guys later. Bye.
Thanks, TK.